very pleased to welcome today Diane Di Prima as our guest poet. Diane Di Prima was born in Brooklyn and wrote in Manhattan for many years, and she became known, as I'm sure you all know, as an important writer of the Beat movement. During that time, she co-founded the New York Poets Theater and founded Poets Press, which published the work of many new writers of the period. Together with Amiri Baraka, Leroy Jones, she edited the literary newsletter The Floating Bear from 1961 to 69. For the past 25 years, she's lived and worked in Northern California, where she took part in many activities and where she raised her 5 children and taught Hermetic and esoteric traditions in poetry, and I think was very instrumental in starting a poetics program at the New College of California. She is the author of 32 books of poetry and prose, including Pieces of a Song from City Lights Books and seminary poems from Floating Island Press. Her work has been translated into 12 languages. She currently lives in San Francisco, where she teaches privately. Her works in progress include Not Quite Buffalo Stew, a satire of California life, The Mysteries of Vision, a book of essays on HD, and One Too Like Thee, a study of Shelley's poetic use of traditional Western magic. Her collected plays, Zip Code, will be published by Coffee House Press, and an autobiographical memoir, Recollections of My Life as a Woman, will be published by Viking Penguin Books in 1994. And those are all the little facts about Diane Di Prima. I think, however, that I can't allow her to come up here and read her poetry without saying that the same kind of courage and energy and honesty that's present in the poems is also present in Diane Di Prima as a person, and I think that it's so wonderful to see that kind of correlation between the person on the page and the person in real life. Let's welcome Diane Di Prima.
My first book that I published, hooray, came out in 1958. The poems were written in the mid-50s till the middle 50s, yeah, 53 to 56, something like that. And the thrust of that time and that culture and that way of writing was really to be very, very understated, to say as little as possible. And so these were poems that said as little as possible, or said as much as possible without saying anything in words, which is an interesting thing to play with for a while. I'll read you a few little things from that time. They're from a series called More or Less Love Poems. You bet your life, next bedtime, I'll get even. I'll call your name wrong, and you'll think it happened accidental. You are not quite the air I breathe, thank God, so go. Those were considered love poems in 1953. They were very affectionate. Here's a very affectionate one. For you, I would no longer pick my so pickable nose or bite my delicious nails. For you, I would fix my teeth and buy a mattress. For you, I would kill my favorite roach that lives in the woodwork by the drawing table. So those were the, it took a lot of, one did a lot of cutting things back at that point, making them as, seeing how much you could say without saying it. And then things changed again. And one was interested in sort of putting stuff back in, but maybe not. I'll read a poem called Numbers Racket. It's from a few years later. It's also a love poem. Numbers Racket. When you take no for an answer, will you look any different? Will you get pale behind your glasses? Will you go backward with that funny step? Will you straighten your jacket? I mean, are you taking it now? Taking no for an answer? And then there were, one got involved in other kinds of things, got interested in long lines and images and filling things out and not being cool all the time. But one other poem I want to read from this early thing is a poem I wrote to my first child before she was born, called Song for Baby-O, Unborn. It's from 1957. Sweetheart, when you break through, you'll find a poet here, not quite what one would choose. I won't promise you'll never go hungry, or that you won't be sad on this gutted, breaking globe. But I can show you, baby, enough to love, to break your heart forever. So skipping a whole lot of time, I would like to read a poem that Maria asked me to read that I wrote in 1968. So 10 years have gone by, many kinds of things have been written. Newsletters have been printed in theaters and presses have been bought and sold, and now it's 1968, and I'm writing to my anarchist grandfather. My mother's father, Domenico Malazio, I'm going to read you a bit about in the prose book I'm working on. This is a poem I wrote him in '68. April Fool's Day was his birthday. April Fool birthday poem for Grandpa. Today is your birthday, and I have tried writing these things before, but now, in the gathering madness, I want to thank you for telling me what to expect, for pulling no punches back there in that scrubbed Bronx parlor. Thank you for honestly weeping in time to innumerable heartbreaking Italian operas, for pulling my hair when I pull the leaves off the trees so I'd know how it feels. We are involved in it now, revolution, up to our knees and the tide is rising. I embrace strangers on the street, filled with their love and mine. The love you told us had to come or we die. Told them all in that Bronx park, me listening in spring Bronx dusk, breathing stars. So glorious to me, your white hair, your height, your fierce blue eyes, rare among Italians. I stood a ways off, looking up at you, my grandpa, people listened to. I stand a ways off listening as I pour out soup. Young men with light in their faces at my table, talking love, talking revolution, which is love, spelled backwards. How you would love us all, would thunder your anarchist wisdom at us, would thunder Dante and Giordano Bruno, orderly men bent to your ends. Well, I want you to know we do it for you and your ilk, for Carlo Tresca, for Sacco and Vanzetti, without knowing it or thinking about it, as we do it for Aubrey Beardsley, Oscar Wilde. All streetlights shall be purple. Do it for Trotsky and Shelley and big dumb Kropotkin, Eisenstein's strike people, Jean Cocteau's ennui. We do it for the stars over the Bronx, that they may look on earth and not be ashamed. Maria also asked me to read this, I guess we're into a family thing here, this poem to my father, which I wrote a couple of years after his death. It's called To My Father. In my dreams, you stand among roses. You are still the fine gardener you were. You worry about mother. You are still the fierce wind, the intolerable force that almost broke me, who forced my young body into awkward and proper clothes, who spoke of his standing in the community. And men's touch is still a little absurd to me, because you trembled when you touched me. What external law were you expounding? How can I take your name like prayer? My youngest son has your eyes. Why are you knocking at the doors of my brain? You kept all their rules and more. What were you promised that you cannot rest? What fierce, angry honesty in the darkness? What can you hope who had preferred my death to the birth of my oldest daughter? O fierce hummer of tunes, forget, eat the black seed cake. In my dreams, you stand at the door of your house and weep for your wife, my mother. So that's all stuff from pre-1970. Leaves out really the main kind of thing I wrote from in the 60s, but I'll read you one of those. There's a kind of way I was writing, and I still write somewhat, which is like very much just using the images to say it, not explaining what they're about, which I began around 1960. I wrote a book of love poems to Amiri Baraka called The New Handbook of Heaven, and they were all written like that. And this is from that book. It's a poem called The Beach. And although it doesn't say so anywhere any more than the earlier cool poems did, it's a love poem. The beach. Where I ship out from, the tides give no indication. Washing dead flowers under the rocks at my back, the houses flat and implacable, painted green. It peels, the walls are damp. The chill at the railroad station in the mornings, always the dawn light and wind, our collars turned up. The suitcase is broken, a gesture, almost empty. Ourselves, the pitiful gray of no baths, no sleep, the gray we rub off the sheets in the green houses. Did we lock the door? The sea is gold in the dawn light, the rocks silhouetted against it. How many years will you amble along the shore, hands in your pockets, whistling the same old tune? Living on soft-shell crabs, the seafloor hard under your clean, bare feet. Just as I caught the train, I think I saw you, shuffling to the horizon to stamp it flat. That was before the picnic basket fell open, and my choice, my monster lobster, walked back home. So moving into later times, I did a lot of traveling in the 70s and wrote a lot about the middle of the country, which I hadn't spent very much time in before then. That's kind of simplistic but true. And did a lot of teaching in places like Wyoming, Montana, Minnesota, Arizona, and so on. A lot of reform schools, a lot of reservation schools, a lot of different kinds of middle of the country work. And this is a poem inspired by a show at the Walker Arts Center in Minneapolis. It was the entire Walker Arts Center, which is huge, was filled with Indian art from all, and it was divided by areas. And you could really see that there wasn't an Indian nation here. There are innumerable different cultures and nations and ways of being and seeing here. And that was part of what pulled the poem out of me. Ironically, the museum on the West Coast later asked for permission to use the poem when they had brought out an Indian potter and had her sit in their museum making pots for our edification. And I was away at the time, and somebody in my house gave them permission, so there was my poem on the wall, and there was her making pots. It's very strange. American Indian Art, Form and Tradition was the title of the show. Were we not fine? Were we not all fine in our buckskin coats, the quill work, the buttons and beads? Were we not fine? Were we not all fine? Oh, they have hung our empty shirts in their cold marble halls. They have labeled our baskets, lighted our masks, disassembled our pipes in glass cases. We flashed in those colors through the dark woods, over the dun plains, in the harsh desert. Where do they hang our breath, our bright glance? Where is our song now, our sorrow? Do you know, yeah, easier to just go from poem to poem. This is my youngest daughter was about 5 when she came with me on a big trip to a big national poetry festival in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And it's called Tara at Grand Rapids 1. On the airplane, she said, "I feel stretched." "Where?" I asked, and she laid her hand on her crown chakra. 2. This morning we went to breakfast. Birds were singing. "Holy, holy, holy, holy," she whispered. "That's what they're saying. Ho-wee, ho-wee, whole wheat." Well, anyway, whole wheat is holy too. Okay, I'm going to share with you a true experience, what it's like to be on the road as a poet. It's a very glamorous profession, very exciting, full of, well, this is called Ramada Inn, Denver. Okay. It's taken a whole day to get from Great Falls to Casper, and I ain't there yet. White fog envelops Great Falls, envelops nearly everything up to Banff, one old Canadian tells me as we bump along on a bus to Helena, where we take a plane to Salt Lake, arrive late, get on late plane to Denver, arrive late, discover that plane to Casper has left without us. Western Airlines puts us up at Ramada Inn. I am too crazed to sleep, take my last $7 and make it to the bar. The only remaining bar stool is in between a rancher from Montana and a blonde, semi-long hair in a suit, probably just out of college. I order a margarita and listen. Turns out the rancher is really a rancher, but the blonde thinks he's James Bond or something. He's a narc, what works with customs for the Air Force in Thailand. He's a great admirer of Thailand, tells me that Bangkok is at least as modern as Rapid City. He's a great admirer of Thailand women who are content to make love for peanuts and beer, or clean and cook for $45 a month. He just left his wife in Great Falls because she was pregnant, and that won't do in Thailand. He's on his way to San Antone to pick up 2 marijuana dogs. In her stead, I want to ask him, but I don't. I'm drinking my second margarita and scared to open my mouth, lest I should drunkenly make the guy suspicious, and he should bring his dogs to sniff the crack under my door. He is coming on strong and liberal. Tells me how stupid he feels sitting all day at the airport with a dog at the end of a leash, smelling suitcases. When the dog gets something, we tear the luggage apart. He's proud in a liberal way. He wants me to know he carries no gun, just handcuffs and mace. He denounces dope while getting drunker and drunker. My second margarita was on the rocks. I cracked the ice cubes nervously between my teeth. The rancher's wife comes in, thank God. She has the art of playing silly woman. She giggles and says she'd much rather live in Glacier than Bangkok. The rancher beams proudly at her. They both drink beer. I love them, madly and drunkenly. I cleverly maneuver off my bar stool, bid everyone good night. Blondie seems disappointed. I maybe forgot to tell him I don't like peanuts. He offers another drink, but I grin wickedly at him and tell him lewdly, no thanks, I'm just drunk enough for a nice hot bath, and walk what I hope is a straight line to the door. The fun, the fun, the fun of the literary life. Ah, yes. I don't want to take too long because I want to read some little bits of other stuff. So anyway, then one traveled for years, and then in '71 I began writing a long poem, which I'm still writing, called Loba, which I don't think I'll stop to read from right now, but maybe later. I would like to read a little bit of the prose book that I'm writing for Viking called Recollections of My Life as a Woman. It was hard to sort of figure out. I've got 337 pages of this stuff by now, and I really couldn't figure out which part to bring. It all weighs too much, so I brought the beginning. And I'm going to read a little of the beginning, which is somewhat about my maternal grandparents. So Recollections of My Life as a Woman, I originally conceived of as a book for my daughters about the dopey things I did because I bought various myths about what a woman is or should be. But in a silly, humorous kind of way, because I didn't think it was the end of the world. And it has proven not to be the end of the world. But then somehow it expanded. It grew to be for more than that. And it's a full-blown memoir now. The manuscript I've promised Viking is 200,000 words, and we'll cut down from that. And I think it'll either cover me through the 60s or through maybe about 78, depends. They think they're getting my whole life, but your life is how you define it, so. So here's the beginning. My earliest sense of what it means to be woman was learned from my grandmother, Antoinette Malazzi, and at her knee. It was a house of dark and mellow light, almost as if there were fire and kerosene lamps. But to my recollection, there was electric light, the same as everywhere else. It is just that the rooms were so very dark, light filtering as it did through paper shades and lace curtains, and falling then on dark, heavy furniture, mahogany and walnut, and onto floors and surfaces yellowed with many layers of wax, layers of lemon oil. The light in the room fell as if on old oil paintings, those glazes, that veneer, sepia portraits, Dante, Emma Goldman. There was a subtle air of mystery. The light fell on my grandmother's hands as she sat rocking, saying her rosary. She smelled of lemons and olive oil, garlic and waxes and mysterious herbs. I loved to touch her skin. There was this mystery. She sat saying her beads, but the beads in her hand never completely left her apron pocket. My grandfather was an atheist, and if she heard his step on the stairs, she would slip the beads out of sight and take up some work. They had lived thus for 40 years, and the mystery was how much they loved each other. To my child's senses already sharpened to conflict, there was no conflict in that house. He was an atheist, she a devout Catholic, and for all intents and purposes, they were one. It would never do to bother to argue with him about God, and so when he came into the room, she slipped the beads away. As for him, he never seemed to inquire, though those clear blue eyes saw everywhere. The I Ching has the phrase, he let many things pass without being duped. My grandmother's Catholicism was of the distinctive Mediterranean variety, tolerant and full of humor. When I was a little older, I would frequently hear her remark at some transgression, sins of the flesh, tales reported by a neighbor in hushed Neapolitan, an exclamation whose inflection communicated humor and seriousness, and a peculiar, almost French irony. My grandmother would say, the Virgin Mary is a woman, she'll explain it to God. This response to the vagaries of human existence, the weaknesses of the flesh, especially female flesh, gave me much pause for thought. It indicated, on the one hand, that the Virgin Mary knew much better than God the ins and outs, so to speak, of human nature, what we were up to, that she had a tolerance and intelligence and humor that was perhaps missing from the male Godhead. It was at my grandmother's side in that scrubbed and waxed apartment that I received my first communications about the specialness and the relative uselessness of men, in this case, my grandfather. There was no doubt that he was the excitement of our days, the fire and light of our lives, and that one of his most endearing qualities was that we had no idea what he was going to do next. But it was the women, and there were many of them, who attended on all the practical aspects of life. In the view that Antoinette Malazzi communicated, there was nothing wrong or strange about this. We women had the babies, after all, and it was enormously more interesting to us than to any man to know that there would be food on the table. Not that I wish in any way to denigrate my grandfather. He worked enormously hard for his family, but he would at any time throw everything over for an ideal. There were many stories of his quitting an otherwise okay job to protest some injustice to a fellow worker, at which point the stories went he would arrive home with the fellow worker and his entire family, at the very least, for dinner. Often they stayed for weeks. My grandmother would set the table for that many more, and if a solution was not rapidly forthcoming, she and the 6 girls would take in crochet beadwork to keep cash coming in until my grandfather found another, less unjust position. Now, this sort of thing was not still going on when I was little. By then, my grandfather was no longer working for others as a custom tailor, but the stories and the memory of it were in the air. My grandfather was regarded somewhat as the family treasure, a powerful and erratic kind of lightning generator, a kind of Tesla experiment we for some reason kept around in the house. It was clear to me that he was as good as it got.